Hey, my name's John, and for the first 30 years of my life I hated Muslims. I'm not proud of that. I'm not here to justify it. I'm here to tell you how it happened and more importantly how it unhappened. Because if someone like me who was raised in a small town fed stereotypes, fear and misinformation for 3 decades can change, then so can you, your neighbor, your classroom, your community. Let me walk you through what I learned. I want to start by telling you something that might make you uncomfortable. I wasn't born hating anyone. I didn't come into this world suspicious of Muslims or anyone else for that matter, and neither did you. Prejudice isn't something we're wired with, it's something we're taught. And for most of us, we learn it without even realizing it. The truth is, I absorbed that bias the same way you absorb language or the smell of your mother's cooking. It was just part of my environment. You grow up in a certain town, watch certain news channels, sit at certain dinner tables, and over time, your worldview gets shaped by repetition and exposure. You hear phrases like, "They're not like us," or "those people are dangerous," and no one corrects it. In fact, people nod, they agree. So you internalize it. Now nobody sat me down and gave me a class on how to hate Muslims. It wasn't that direct. It's more subtle. It's the jokes people don't push back on. It's the movies where the villain always seems to have a foreign accent. It's the way people say them and us, like we live on 2 different planets. It's fear disguised as patriotism. It's ignorance dressed up as tradition. And it all adds up. You carry it with you, and you don't even question it, because questioning it would mean questioning the people who raised you, the voices you trust, the world you thought you understood. But here's the problem. Just because something feels familiar doesn't mean it's right. Bias becomes part of your subconscious programming. It's like downloading a virus onto your mental hard drive and thinking it's just part of the software. You see the world through a distorted lens, and everything that confirms that bias feels true, while everything that contradicts it feels wrong or suspicious. That's not truth, that's conditioning. And once I realized that, really realized it, it hit me hard. I had spent years judging people I never even met, based on beliefs I didn't choose, based on fear I didn't examine. That's the danger of learned bias. It becomes invisible to you. You don't recognize it as a problem because it feels normal. You think, well, that's just how things... No, it's just how things have been taught to you. We teach kids how to tie their shoes, how to cross the street, how to say please and thank you. But we also teach them, without even knowing it, how to judge people, who to fear, who to exclude. And unless we interrupt that learning, it keeps going. It becomes generational. But here's the hopeful part. If you can learn something, you can also unlearn it. You're not doomed to carry the ignorance of your past. You're not stuck with the lessons you inherited from people who never questioned what they inherited. You can interrupt the pattern. You can challenge your own thinking. You can change the channel literally and mentally. The first step is awareness. You have to stop and ask, why do I believe what I believe? Who told me this? Where did I learn it? And is it even true? If you never pause to ask those questions, you'll live your whole life on autopilot, running programs someone else installed. I lived like that for 3 decades. And I'm telling you, when I finally stepped back and asked myself those hard questions, it changed everything. It didn't happen overnight, but it started with one choice: to look at my own beliefs with honesty, not judgment. Because you can't change what you won't and you can't confront what you won't admit exists. So no, bias isn't in our DNA, it's in our environment, it's in our culture, it's in our habits of thought. And the good news, that means it's also something we can outgrow. Fear is one of the most powerful forces shaping our beliefs, and most of us don't even realize it. We think our opinions are based on facts, logic, or personal experience. But often they're rooted in fear. Not the kind of fear you feel when you're in real danger, like being chased by a... I'm talking about subtle, quiet fear. The fear of the unknown. The fear of people who are different from us. The fear of what we don't understand. That kind of fear is sneaky. It doesn't show up screaming. It shows up in assumptions, in avoidance, in stereotypes. And the more you feed that fear, the more it builds walls around you. I didn't know it then, but for 30 years I wasn't really protecting myself from anyone. I was just listening to fear whispering lies in my ear. Be careful, they're not safe, they don't belong here, they don't share your values. And I believed it, because fear is persuasive, and fear is easy. It's easier to fear than to learn. It's easier to stick with what's familiar than to ask questions. And our brains love ease. Your brain's #1 job is to keep you safe. And when it encounters something unfamiliar like a religion, culture, or practice you don't understand, it throws up red flags. But just because something is unfamiliar doesn't mean it's dangerous. It just means you haven't taken the time to understand it. Think about it. How many times have you judged someone based not on what you know but on what you've heard? That's fear talking. How many times have you seen a story in the news and thought, I knew it, because it confirmed a fear you already had? That's fear, looking for validation. We don't realize how often our fear isn't actually about facts. It's about comfort, and anything that challenges that comfort gets labeled as a threat. This fear-driven mindset leads to division. It separates us from them. It turns neighbors into strangers. It turns curiosity into suspicion. And over time, it creates a world where we stop seeing people as individuals and start seeing them as categories. That's not just unfair, it's dangerous. The irony is that most of the time, the people we're afraid of are just living their lives, minding their business, trying to raise families, build futures, and be good human beings, just like us. But fear blinds us to that. It paints whole groups of people with one brush and convinces us that everyone in that group thinks, acts, and believes the same. And once we believe that, we stop engaging, we stop listening, we stop seeing. That's exactly what happened to me. I avoided Muslims. I made assumptions. I repeated stereotypes without ever asking myself if they were true. Not because I had real reasons, but because fear told me I did. That fear went unchallenged for 30 years. Then one moment shattered it. One person, one act of courage, one human connection that made fear look ridiculous. That's how fragile fear actually is. It seems big, but it's built on very little, usually just ignorance and repetition. The moment I looked past fear and actually saw a Muslim person for who he really was, kind, brave, selfless, I realized how much I had missed out on, how many connections I could have made, how many friendships I never had, how much peace I never gave myself a chance to feel. You can't build bridges when you're ruled by fear. You can't grow if fear is in the driver's seat. And you certainly can't understand someone you've already decided to The good news is, fear loses its power the second you challenge it with truth. The second you ask, is this really true? The moment you get curious instead of cautious, you want to stop the division. Start by questioning the fear that created it. You can live your entire life, thinking one thing about a group of people, and then boom, one encounter, one moment, one human being, changes everything. That's what happened to me. 30 years of built-up bias and fear came crashing down in a single afternoon. Not through a debate, not through a documentary, not through a fact sheet, through a person. Here's what I've learned. It's really hard to hate up close. You can judge from a distance, but the second you get face to face with someone, when you hear their voice, see their eyes, feel their presence, your assumptions start to fall apart. And what's left isn't a category, it's a human. That's where real change starts. The thing about prejudice is that it works best in the abstract. You imagine who someone is without ever meeting them. You fill in the blanks with fear, stereotypes, secondhand stories, and media headlines. And if no one challenges that narrative, you start treating your version of them as if it's the truth. But it's not the truth. It's a mask, a projection, and it can vanish the second you sit across from someone and really listen. For me, it wasn't even a long conversation. It wasn't a moment of compassion. I was in a car wreck. Smoke, glass, panic, the whole thing. I was stuck, couldn't get my seatbelt off. My chest was bleeding. And through the chaos, I remember seeing someone run toward me, not away toward. He broke the window, pulled me out, stayed with me until help came. That man's name was Ahmed. He was Muslim. He had a beard. He wore a ring with an Arabic inscription. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at a headline. I wasn't seeing a label. I was seeing a man, kind, selfless, calm in crisis, literally putting his safety on the line for mine. And here's the crazy part. 10 minutes before that crash, I still carried the same bias. 10 minutes before that, I probably would have crossed the street to avoid him. That's how quickly things can shift when real humanity shows up. I remember lying in the ambulance, trying to make sense of what just happened, and I couldn't stop thinking, how could someone I've spent years distrusting be the one who just saved my life? And more importantly, what else have I been wrong about? That's the moment the walls started to come down. Not because someone convinced me with statistics, not because I read a powerful quote, but because someone extended humanity to me when I needed it most. And that act made it impossible to keep pretending he was my enemy. That's what connection does. It exposes the lie. It makes the general personal. Suddenly, it's not those people anymore. It's this person, this father, this friend, this stranger who didn't hesitate to help. And once you see someone in their full humanity, the categories stop making sense. We often think change has to be huge, but it doesn't. Sometimes it's just one handshake, one conversation, one shared meal, one moment that makes you pause and say, wait, maybe I've had this all wrong. If you've been taught to fear a group of people, go meet one of them, not with an agenda, not to debate, just to see, because the human-to-human connection is where the learning really begins. That's where empathy grows. That's where stories are exchanged. That's where stereotypes die. It took one person to change my mind, one person to start undoing 30 years of damage. And that tells me something powerful. If one connection can break the pattern for me, it can do the same for anyone. Most people think hate is permanent, like once it's there, it becomes a part of who you are, like eye color or height. But it's not. Hate is a mental habit, and like any habit, it can be unlearned. And I know that because I did it. For 30 years I held beliefs I never once stopped to question. I hated Muslim. I didn't use that word out loud, because I knew it sounded ugly. But let's not sugarcoat this. My actions, my assumptions, my avoidance, my judgment, that was hate. It was just wearing socially acceptable clothes. I used to believe that people who were different from me were wrong. Not just different wrong. Their culture was wrong. Their religion was wrong. Their values, traditions, clothing wrong. That was the narrative playing in the background of my life. And the worst, I thought that belief system made me a good American, a proud Christian, a strong man. But really it just made me small, closed off, afraid. And then came the moment everything changed. When Ahmed saved my life, something cracked open in me. And what rushed in first was not love, it was confusion. It didn't make sense. The person I had feared, avoided, judged, had just risked his life for me. It didn't fit into my story. So I had two options: keep clinging to the old beliefs, and twist reality to fit them, or let the moment challenge what I thought I knew. I chose the second, not because it was easy, because it was necessary. Here's the truth. Unlearning hate doesn't mean flipping a switch. It means doing the work. You have to dig into the roots. You have to ask uncomfortable questions. You have to admit you were wrong. Not once, but many times. That's humbling. That's painful, but it's also liberating. I started reading books I would have mocked 5 years. I started listening to Muslim voices, really listening, not waiting for a reason to disagree. I watched documentaries, I talked to people, I asked questions that exposed my ignorance, and instead of defending my ego, I let it get smaller so my perspective could get bigger. I realized I had never actually known a Muslim before Ahmed. I knew ideas about Muslims. I knew the headlines, the political talking points, the exaggerated fears, but not one single relationship, not one real story. So I changed that. I made it my mission to meet, to listen, to learn, not to debate, to learn. That's what unlearning is: replacing assumptions with experiences, replacing fear with understanding, replacing judgment with curiosity, and little by little, it chips away at the walls. At first you don't even notice, but then you find yourself in a conversation you would have avoided. You find yourself feeling empathy instead of suspicion. You find yourself defending someone you used to fear. That's progress. And here's the thing. They didn't change. You did. Your lens changed. You cleaned off the filter that was fogged with years of inherited garbage. And once you see clearly, you can't unsee. But I want to be real with you. Unlearning hate is uncomfortable. It will mess with your identity. It will make you question where your beliefs came from, your family, your school, your church, your social circle. It will make you realize that some people you love may still be stuck in that old mindset. And it will make you decide, do I stay quiet or do I speak? Do I blend in or do I challenge the pattern? That's a hard place to stand, but it's also a powerful one, because once you've unlearned hate, once you've felt that freedom, you start to become part of the solution. You become the person who holds space for the next person to learn. You become the voice of reason in the room, full of noise. If you take nothing else from my story, take this. Just because you were raised to believe something doesn't mean it's true. Just because you've carried a belief for decades, doesn't mean you need to keep. And just because hate once felt like part of your identity, doesn't mean it has to define your future. You can unlearn. You can grow. You can become someone new. Not perfect, but better, more open, more human. And that's a choice worth making. Here's a hard truth I had to face. You can't heal from something you're not willing to take responsibility for. And I'm not talking about blame, I'm talking about ownership. I spent 30 years holding on to hate, fear, and judgment, like they were truths, but they weren't. They were choice. And the minute I stopped pointing fingers and started looking in the mirror, everything began to change. We live in a world where it's easier to blame others for how we feel than to take a hard look at ourselves. We say things like, well, they're the problem, or that's just how I was raised, or you don't understand what I've been through. I get it. It feels safer to stay in victim mode, but healing doesn't happen there. Growth doesn't happen there. Responsibility is the bridge between the pain you're carrying and the peace you want to find. When Ahmed pulled me out of that car, it wasn't just my body that was shaken. It was my entire belief system, and the first instinct I had was to push it away, to say, well, he's the exception. But deep down I knew better. I knew this wasn't a one-off, it was a wake-up call. And I had a choice: go back to sleep, or take responsibility for the fact that I'd been wrong. Not just wrong, but unwilling to. Taking responsibility meant acknowledging that I hadn't taken the time to understand what I feared. It meant realizing that I let second-hand opinions shape my world. It meant admitting that I had hurt people, not directly, maybe, but through silence, through judgment, through cold stares, through complicity. That was the gut punch. I had to face the fact that my bias didn't just live in my head. It showed up in how I treated people. It showed up in what I laughed at, what I avoided, who I included, and who I ignored. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. But here's where the real power came in. Responsibility also gave me the key to change, because once I stopped blaming my upbringing, my environment, or the media, I realized I had the power to rewire everything. I could choose new thoughts. I could seek out new voices. I could repair relationships, open my heart, and take real steps forward. Healing, I've learned, is not passive. It's not something that just happens with time. Healing is a decision. It's a muscle you build through uncomfortable action. You sit with the discomfort. You apologize. You ask questions. You read. You unlearn. And then you do it again. Taking responsibility also means giving yourself permission to evolve. A lot of people stay stuck in shame once they realize they've been wrong. But shame is not a strategy. Responsibility is. You don't have to beat yourself up for the person you used to be, but you do have to be accountable. You have to say, I didn't know better, but now I do. And now that I do, I won't go back. When I began to take responsibility for my mindset, my words, my actions, it opened doors I never expected. I began having conversations I used to avoid. I reached out to people I had silently judged. I listened, not to respond, not to defend, but to understand. And in that process, I began to heal not just the damage I had done to others, but the damage I had done to myself. Because here's the thing about hate. It doesn't just hurt the people you direct it toward. It hardens you. It isolates you. It poisons your inner world. And taking responsibility is how you start flushing that out. It's how you reclaim your peace. So if you're carrying hate, or bias, or pain, ask yourself, am I willing to take responsibility for what I believe, for what I've repeated, for what I've ignored? Because healing doesn't begin when someone else changes. It begins the moment you choose to. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes when you stop hiding from your past and start owning it. I used to believe that certain parts of my story were too ugly to speak aloud, especially the hate I carried for so long. I figured if I buried it deep enough, it would go away, but it doesn't. What you bury doesn't die, it grows in the dark. It controls you silently, and the only way to take that power back is to drag it into the light. When I tell people I hated Muslims for 30 years, I see their eyes widen. Some are shocked, some pull back, some don't know what to say. But I keep talking anyway because that was my truth. I don't share it to shock. I share it to show what's possible when you choose to confront your story instead of letting it define you. We all have stories we're ashamed of. Maybe it's a belief you carried, a mistake you made, a person you hurt, or something you ran from. And the instinct is always to hide, cover it up with perfection, mask it with pride. But here's the thing, when you don't own your story, it owns you. It shapes your decisions, your relationships, your worldview, and you don't even realize it's happening. That's what happened to me. I lived for decades with a script running in the background of my mind, and that script said, people who are different from you are dangerous. And because I never questioned it, it kept playing. It wrote my reactions. It filtered my conversation. It put limits on who I trusted, who I helped, and even who I saw as human. And then one act of compassion shattered that script. A Muslim man saved my life, and suddenly, The story didn't make sense anymore. I had to rewrite it. But to do that, I had to go back and face what was in there. Owning your story isn't about being proud of everything in your past. It's about being honest about it. Because when you're honest, you take away shame's power. You stop hiding. And once you stop hiding, you give others permission to do the same. I started telling my story not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted accountability. I wanted people to see that change is real, that redemption is possible, that even the ugliest beliefs can be transformed with truth, humility and action. And you know what happened? People started opening up to me. People who had their own biases, people who had judged others in silence, people who had been judged by others and carried the pain. They told me that hearing my story gave them hope. Hope that the people who hurt them could change, and hope that they too could face their own truth without shame. That's the power of storytelling. It builds bridges, it connects strangers, it makes you feel less alone. And in a world that's so divided, that's exactly what we need. You don't have to have the perfect words, you don't have to have it all figured out, you just have to be real. When you speak from the scar and not the wound, when you say this is who I was, this is what I believed, and this is what I've learned, you turn your past into a tool, not a trap. If I've learned anything through this journey, it's that hiding never brings healing. Silence doesn't bring clarity, and pretending doesn't create connection, but honesty, that opens doors you didn't even know were closed. So if you're carrying a story you're ashamed of, know this, you don't have to be proud of it to share it, you just have to be willing to tell the truth. And when you do, you become the example someone else needed, not of perfection, but of possibility. Your story, even the messy parts, can be the thing that sets someone else free. But first, it has to set you free. And that starts when you stop running and say, this is who I am, and this is who I've chosen to become. So here I am, standing in front of you not as someone who figured it all out, but as someone who finally woke up. I spent 30 years of my life, hating people I never knew, fearing people I never met, and carrying beliefs I never questioned. And it wasn't a TED Talk, a protest sign or a debate that changed me. It was one human being, one act of compassion, one moment that forced me to confront the story I'd been living. And here's the truth I can't ignore anymore. Hate is loud, but it is not permanent. Bias can be deep, but it can be dug out. And fear only survives when we stay in the dark. The moment we face it, speak it, and challenge it, that's the moment it starts to break. I'm not proud of who I used to be, but I am proud of who I chose to become, because I did the work I learned. I asked better questions, I got uncomfortable, and slowly, I changed. That's the message I want to leave you with today. No matter what you've carried, no matter what you were taught, no matter what fear or anger or judgment has lived inside you, you can change. You can take responsibility, you can own your story, and you can become a bridge instead of a barrier. You don't need to wait for a life or death moment like I did. You can choose right now. You can decide to look someone in the eye instead of looking away. You can listen to understand, not just to respond. You can reach across a divide and say, tell me your story. Because real connection doesn't happen through silence. It happens through courage and healing. That starts with truth. Thank you.